it's profound because I know what you're thinking. Well, that was just a racist officer and those were racist prosecutors. But it really is the system. The system is racist because there's no way you can get these numbers. Either you got to conclude one or two things. Black people, especially black men, are just some terrible, nefarious, criminal minded people, number one. Or number two, you got to conclude that the system broken. I don't believe all black men are nasty, evil, criminal people. And you have to first admit that to yourself. The system is racist.
This season, each of our programs will highlight a different topic, united by the theme Truth and Responsibility. We'll use this theme as a lens for exploring the pivotal role truth and responsibility play in shaping a just, moral society for all. By examining these tenets across a diverse set of timely and complex issues, we'll seek answers to critical questions that define us not just as a Jewish community, but as humans in a constantly changing world. Our series engages panelists with varying and oftentimes opposing viewpoints as a means of bringing a deeper understanding and respect to the important issues with which we wrestle. Tonight we present Criminal Injustice in America, an examination of the role race plays in the criminal justice system from policing to prosecuting.
Because for so long there have been some truths that have not been told. And there is a greater responsibility that all of us have to the notion of justice. People refer to the criminal justice system. I prefer the term the criminal legal system because for many people, particularly Black and Latino people and poor people, there is no justice in this system. There is this concept or this notion called badges and incidents. When the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution was passed and ratified, the spirit behind it was that not only would it outlaw slavery except for punishment for people duly convicted of crimes, but it was intended to eliminate the badges and incidents of slavery. And one of the things that you see is that it did not necessarily do that. Yes, it may have outlawed slavery in and of itself as an institution, but it did not end slavery as a part of the fabric of this nation's identity. And from the post-Reconstruction period where you see the rise of Black codes that criminalize Black behavior, to convict leasing where Black people were scooped up off of corners for being vagrant or for not having a job or not being duly employed by a white person, or for anti-miscegenation laws to keep and maintain the plantation system. The largest prison in the state of Louisiana is Angola Prison, and that was one of the largest plantations. And so there is a seamless thread that runs through our nation's history of slavery, through Reconstruction, through convict leasing, through Jim Crow, up to the war against poverty or the war on poverty, through the war on crime, war on drugs. And the consistent theme is the criminalization and incarceration of Black bodies. And it has grown to expand to include poor people and Latino people. And now we are looking at the criminalization of people given their immigration status. And so tonight's conversation, we really want to look at what this system is, and more importantly, how it impacts the lives of so many people in this country. And just as a preface to begin this conversation, I mentioned some of the conditions that have existed that have criminalized Black people. Without going into the full narrative of your story, could you talk a little bit about the community that you came from and how law enforcement and policing happened in your community?
I come from a predominantly Black neighborhood. The police was predominantly white. Had, just like today, had the authority to stop you whenever they wanted to stop you, falsely accuse you whenever they wanted to falsely accuse you. But we tried our best to do the best we could in the situation being in the South in Alabama. You grows up with a fear of police officers instead of a
feeling of knowing them by their name is always, yes, sir. And my mom always told us, whenever we got pulled over, always give them the most of respect. Everything had to be yes, sir, no, sir. Whatever you tell us to do, we did it. If they said lay on the ground, you lay on the ground. And, you know, my neighborhood was not any different than any other black neighborhood when it came to police. They had the authority, they had the ability to take you to jail, to do whatever they want to you. And so you just learn live in a constant fear when it came to the police officer.
And so that fear is a very tangible and real fear, and I think it's what you experience on the street, but also what you see by the people who are removed from the community. Nicole, I'd like to ask you a little bit about your work. There's this reference to the criminal justice system or the criminal legal system as this monolithic system that is one thing, but in reality, it's probably comprised of a bunch of smaller systems. Can you tease apart how those systems interplay with one another, and specifically how the racial disparities are represented within that system or those systems?
Sure. Let me just start by saying that the Sentencing Project is a research and advocacy organization. So I'm going to throw a few statistics at you, but behind each statistic we know is the person behind each data set that we study and look at and try to find conclusions about we know as a neighborhood. Many like the neighborhood that I grew up in Northeast Houston, where when I was in my early 20s, late teens, I looked around one day and realized that a lot of the guys that I had grown up with were locked up, and I was at a point where people were just cycling in and out of jail. And it was some of those incidents and experiences that led me to get politicized and really want to get involved in this work. In fact, my twin brother was incarcerated when we were in our early 20s, and his incarceration also really inspired me. So nationally, 2.2 million people are locked up on any given day, and it is true that what brings people into the system is a mix of policy and practice that's driven by the intersection of different systems that comprise the criminal justice system. And what's important to realize is that defendants of color, particularly Black defendants, experience cumulative disadvantage starting not even from the point of arrest, I would say from the point of interaction with law enforcement in their neighborhoods, particularly urban neighborhoods that are disadvantaged, that are oftentimes the site of very intense police scrutiny. And even before someone starts developing an arrest record, we're talking about young children, adolescent, teens. Those police interactions can socialize them and how they interact with law enforcement. And eventually there's a high likelihood that many young boys in urban areas will eventually get an arrest record. And each arrest, each contact with the police can bring people, particularly young boys of color, into the system further and further. And if they do end up offending at the point of sentencing, those previous contacts with police disadvantages them at the point of sentencing, resulting in the sentencing disparities that drive mass incarceration, that drive disproportionality and the overrepresentation of African Americans in the system. And those disadvantages can even follow people long after they've completed their sentence. In some instances and in some states, people can have barriers and be locked out of civic life for the rest of their life with the felony conviction. So I'm sure we'll get to it. You have states like Florida, Virginia, Kentucky, where people can be barred for voting for the rest of their life because of that felony conviction. A lot of the disadvantages in the Black community for a range of social issues, including education, housing, and other quality of life issues also reinforce and exacerbate racial disparities in the criminal justice system. And in many communities around the country, people can live with these barriers and these exclusions for life. And it is that cumulative disadvantage that continues to drive the disparities within the system.
So one of the drivers a lot of people talk has been the war on drugs as a major driver of mass incarceration. And so, Ronal, you've had the opportunity to serve in law enforcement on the ground, but also have a different perspective now as a professor and an instructor. Is that an appropriate view that the war on drugs has been the driver of mass incarceration, the driver of racial disparities? There's been a critique of that. Is that appropriate? What is really driving this?
Well, first off, thank you for being here tonight, and the JCC and the fellow panel members for an opportunity to speak with you tonight. What I'm going to tell you real quickly sounds like I couldn't keep a job. Right? So I joined the New Orleans Police Department in 1980 before the war on drugs, before the war on crime, before the fear that just enveloped this nation in the 80s and 90s. And in the mid-90s, I became the person responsible for reforming the New Orleans Police Department with Richard Pennington. And the nation was afraid. And in the early 2000s, I became a state police chief in Washington State for 3 years. Then I became the police chief in Nashville, Tennessee for 7 years. And the nation was still afraid of crime. I was talking to one of the panelists, Nicole, if I would have been at this meeting when I was the chief in Nashville, or in 2010, going back to New Orleans, which had regained its dubious distinction of the second most dangerous city in America for African-American men for murder. And I was to tell you what I'm about to tell you as the founding co-chair of law enforcement leaders to reduce crime and reduce incarceration, housed in the Brennan Center at NYU School of Law, you would look at me like I'd lost my mind. When people are afraid, like they were in the 80s and 90s, it propelled a tremendous amount of legislation. And it is fair to say that the police are the tip of that sword. And it's fair to say that history tells us police have been the tip of the sword of enforcing slavery, of enforcing Jim Crow, of enforcing immigration, as we're in that debate still today. By the way, there's a bunch of lawyers in the room. You know there's less than 600 people can fix immigration. The Congress, the Senate, the President, the Supreme Court, they don't fix it. Mm-hmm. And they put that on the backs of local police officers, and they put that on the backs, and folks, whether you're a D or an R, it's been going on no matter who's in charge. So what is driving mass incarceration? Law enforcement leaders, professor at Loyola University in New Orleans, longtime police chief. In the mid-'60s, no matter what your political stripe might be, it was in the mid-'60s that the United States started moving away from mental health care and incentivizing the states to close institutions, right? The ratio of mental health beds in 2010 to the population of the United States was the same as it was in 1850. Men and women who wear uniforms every day are arresting people. 1 in 4 jail inmates, that's your local jail, 1 in 4 jail inmates have been told or exhibit signs of serious psychological disorder. Less than 35% of them are receiving any treatment. So what's driving a lot of the mass incarceration problem is 2 things. The nation was afraid and riveted with the fear of crime such that President Clinton had to run on that as a campaign issue in 1992, and are abject walking away from mental health. It's an amazing thing that you should know this. 2.3 million people on any given day are in America's jails and prisons. Half of them, and there's probably nobody I know disagrees with this anymore, at least half of them, serious mental health problems. And we are spending on average $25,000 to $30,000 a year to put someone in a prison bed to be treated by cops and jailers, as opposed to a hospital bed to be treated by nurses and doctors, and we shake our head at 2 o'clock in the morning when everything goes to heck in a handbasket, and that person who needed mental health treatment is in fact in a deadly exchange with a police officer. Oftentimes, upwards of 25% of those events, the police officer or another officer had brought that person for mental health treatment before the event that got horrible. The American Psychiatric Association did a 10-year study of police shootings and estimated that 36% of the people killed did this thing that's called suicide by cop. In other words, they had wanted to end their life, and they used an encounter with a police officer to do so. And our police officers, my final point, I love them. Been a cop all my life. And I'm no apologist for them. I've fired them. I put them in jail. But today in America, our average cop is probably 24 years old with less than 30 hours of college education. Nobody's ever followed up at getting them greater education. And then we all have every politician running to the microphone when something goes wrong. Who passes the budgets? Who establishes the pay plans? Who establishes the union rules? It's got to be this. To reform criminal justice for the sake of reforming police misses the whole Titanic. The whole system has to be reformed. The police are the tip of the spear, but the system has to be reformed.
And so, Benjamin Crump, your practice has received a lot of attention for some of the high-profile cases that you've dealt with in terms of police misconduct. But my sense is, as a former prosecutor myself and a civil rights attorney, that there's a lot of less high-profile cases that you see. And so, Ronal talked about kind of the mental health crisis. But what about those cases where it's not a mental health crisis and there is police behavior? What are you seeing?
Certainly. And like the chief and other panelists, I'd like to say thank you for having this conversation. It's very important that we talk honestly about these issues that affect our children. And it really comes down to our children. And Mr. Reverend Hall, I think as I go around the country, everybody wants to talk about Trayvon Martin, who's 17 years old, walking home with a bag of Skittles and a can of iced tea in Sanford, Florida, or Michael Brown in Ferguson that Attorney O'Neill and my firm had the honor of representing, who was killed in broad daylight, 18 years old, by a Ferguson police officer, or 12-year-old Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Ohio, who was playing in the playground by himself. And the police officer rolled up in less than 2 seconds, Reverend Hall, and you can watch the video, don't take Ben Crump's word for it, and was shot and killed. And his little sister came out of the community center crying to get to her brother in the snow. And you see how the police officers offered her no consideration, no humanity when she was screaming and crying, "That's my little brother." They tackled her in the snow. She tried to get back up. They tackled her again. And then they handcuffed her, dragged her into the back of the police car, the same car that you see come up at the beginning of the video, and put her in the backseat handcuffed while they leave her little brother laying on the ground in the snow, bleeding to death, and she watches the whole thing. And so you see all these terrible incidents. And I say all of those things because for all three of those cases, there are literally hundreds of cases that nobody ever talks about. It happens in every community, every day in America. And that's not the worst thing. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, the worst thing is not Trayvon getting profiled, pursued, and shot in the heart. I think what's worse than that is in courtrooms every day in America, little black and brown people are killed over and over again when they have the similar fact patterns to little white children. But yet, little white children are given the benefit of the doubt, the benefit of consideration, the benefit of possibility and hope, where little black and brown children are often taken to the corner of the courtroom, fingerprinted, handcuffed, and convicted of a felony that they would have to bear like a cross for the rest of their entire lives. And I agree with the chief. I agree with Mr. Hinton and Ms. Porter. The police are not the big problem. They're on the bottom of the totem pole. It's the prosecutors, the judges, the elected officials who perpetuate this system over and over again. Because when these little black and brown children are convicted of these felonies, even though they're not physically dead, they are the walking dead. They just haven't gotten the death certificate yet. The ACLU does incredible work where they tell us about the 48,000 collateral consequences that comes from being convicted of a felony. I mean, much less not being able to get a job, you can't vote, you can't serve on a jury. Many times you can't even take your children certain places. It's so many things that come with having these felony convictions, the probation that goes with it. And if you turn the wrong way, you're back in jail. You're paying these fines for for-profit probation. We talk about for-profit prisons. Right now they have for-profit probation that keep you in a perpetual cycle. For-profit policing that we learned in Ferguson, Missouri. When you thought about what really was going on in Ferguson, it was almost like this community was in a war zone. And every time they drove, they were getting fined and given tickets that they couldn't afford. And then it would end up costing them more and more, like a vicious cycle. You're in jail, your bill going up, and you can never escape it. And that's what we're battling, this intellectual justification of discrimination. Because when you get right down to it, the crux of the matter, we have to speak truth to power. It's about discrimination, and we can't talk about all these technical things without getting to the crux of the matter.
And so, yeah.
Said earlier. Certainly fear was a part of what has driven mass incarceration, but I think we should also be clear that when crime increased in the United States in the 60s and 70s, a lot of which, racist dog whistles were used to link that to civil rights activism and the riots that were happening in the late 60s. But crime also increased in other countries around the world too. It increased in Scandinavia, it increased in Germany, and politicians in those countries did not respond in the same way that American politicians responded with the expansion of mass incarceration through the adoption of mandatory minimums, the adoption of life without parole policies. People in the audience may be surprised to know that the United States is the only Western country that has historically sentenced children to life without parole, most for serious offenses. It is true. But the reality is that law enforcement practitioners, from police to judges to parole boards, make decisions about the future of young Black and Latino boys when they're in their courtrooms and when they have the discretion over their future. And when that fear surfaced in the 60s and the 70s as a result of increases in violent crime, in Germany, politicians chose to hold their prison rates flat. Scandinavian politicians chose to dramatically reduce their prison rate by investing in early childhood education, investing in a social services infrastructure where the outcome was not increased incarceration, but other outcomes. But US politicians chose to dramatically scale up the incarceration and buy new prison beds, as opposed to buying new classrooms, as opposed to addressing inequality that we know drives violence and led to increases in crime.
And so I want to turn to you, Chief, because I think there's a tension that exists there, because there's a lot of people that'll say, well, race is a factor, but it's not the core factor. You have good, hardworking police out there that are doing their work, but we kind of talked about the ties to slavery and how law enforcement, how do you rationalize that? How do you bridge that gap?
Well, the first thing to do is remember that it's fun to beat up on politicians and the media. But the first 3 strikes and you're outlaw was passed in California on a vote of the people at over 70%. That was a message to the politicians who were listening that the nation wanted something done. So let's be fair to them too. The question is, if half the people in prisons and jails are suffering from an underlying mental health condition, that still means we have another half that there are these deep, deep questions. Police officers don't create mandatory minimum sentences. They follow the rules, they follow the law, they do the investigations. Law enforcement leaders, we are absolutely in support of the 36 states in the nation who have made some modest reforms, reasonable reforms, whatever those reforms are politically tenable. Because here's what I think is the key that has to be looked at. We expect police officers to do things, but what do we give them as tools? In almost all of America, if you are a young person who's dealing with some underlying issue that you're seeking drugs and alcohol to self-medicate yourself, which is a lot of people, and your city or your community or your state has no dry out centers, has no rehabilitation centers, has no mental health emergency care facilities, and that police officer gets rolled to that house at 2 o'clock in the morning, here's the worst possible thing that's going to happen. It happens every day in America. A white police officer is called into an African American home or a Latino home, and the people are calling because their son is acting strange, he's off his meds. Is the last thing they want that person to do is be taken to jail? Of course it is. What tools do we give the cops? And I'm not excusing bad behavior, and I'm not excusing we need de-escalation training, and I'm not excusing we need crisis intervention skills. What I'm not excusing is this. In a city I'm intimately familiar with right now, where a lot of people drink, a lot, there's not a single facility provided for by the city or state for that officer to bring someone for mental health or drug and alcohol rehabilitation. They're going to commit some criminal violation someplace. They're going to create some law violation. And the business owner or the property owner is going to say, Chief, officer, I'm really sorry about that guy's problem, but he just broke my window in my business and I want him out of here.
So let me jump in because I want to, you're alluding to the lack of tools that law enforcement have, but I think there's something a little more nefarious at work, or at least a lot of people perceive that. And Mr. Hinton, your experience, you spent 30 years of your life on death row, charged with a crime that you did not commit. Could you talk a little bit about what the police did and then what the prosecutors went on to do in your case?
The police officer did one thing, found the first African American that was light-skinned and had a full black beard. That's what I was arrested for.
And what was the underlying crime that they were investigating?
They was arrested looking for first-degree robbery, first-degree kidnapping, first-degree attempted murder. Once they came to the house and arrested me and took me to jail, I asked the detective, can you tell me what date and what time this crime took place? And he told me the date and the time. And I said, if you're telling me the truth, thank God I was at work at that particular date and that particular time. And I said, thank God again, my supervisor happened to be white. Gave him the telephone number, they went, stayed gone for about 4 hours, they come back, said, we no longer gonna charge you for first-degree robbery, first-degree kidnap, first-degree attempted murder. You was at work, your alibi checks out. But now we have decided that we're going to charge you with 2 counts of first-degree capital murder. I said, but I haven't killed anyone. The officer had told me earlier he didn't care whether I did it or didn't do it, but he was going to make sure that I was found guilty of it. And when he charged me with 2 counts of first-degree capital murder, I said, but I haven't killed anyone. He said, you must have a hearing problem. Didn't I tell you on the way here, I don't care whether you did it or didn't do it? I still mean that. He said, I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure that you found guilty of it. He said, in fact, there's 5 things that are going to convict you. Would you like to know what they are? And I said, yes. He said, number 1, you're black. Number 2, a white man is going to say you shot him, whether you shot him or not. He said, I don't care. He said, number 3, you're going to have a white prosecutor. Number 4, you're going to have a white judge. And number 5, more than likely, you're going to have an all-white jury. And he looked at me and he said, do you know what that spells? He said, conviction, 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 conviction. And I often tell people today, if I could meet that detective, I would reach my hand out and shake his hand and say, you was dead on the money. Those are the 5 things that convicted me. Sent me to a 5x7 for 30 years. And I often tell people, I wish I could tell them that the state of Alabama made an honest mistake. But the state of Alabama didn't make no mistake. Just like so many other states don't make mistakes. I was a black male. I was 29 years old. And I often say, and I have to say this, At 29, I was probably the best looking black male you could ever run across.
That's right.
You know, and I couldn't believe that we had a system that could take a man from cutting grass to death row. I couldn't believe it because I have always been taught that if you haven't done anything, you have no reason to run. You have no reason to lie. I'm the one told the police that my mother had a gun. Told them what kind. Had no idea that they would go back to my mother's house and pretend that this is the murder weapon. But they did that.
Let me jump in real quick. Attorney Crump, I see you want to get in.
I just want to say a couple of things to Mr. Hinton. We've gotten to become very familiar since we started talking about this panel. I'm honored to host a television show that's coming out called Evidence of Innocence about wrongfully incarcerated individuals that have been exonerated by clear and convincing evidence and DNA evidence. And I wish I could tell you that Mr. Hinton's story was an anomaly, that it was rare. But the Innocence Project statistics say that there are over 100,000, at least 100,000 individuals sitting in prison who are completely 100% innocent. And the overwhelming majority of those individuals are black men. And the stories that we chronicled in this TV series is unbelievable because not only is Mr. Hinton correct that they target black men, in many instances, the prosecutors are lying, committing fraud, deceit, and doing all manner of terrible things. And when they are exposed, what happens to them, Mr. Hinton?
They get promoted.
They get promoted.
So one of the things, let me jump in real quick, because one of the things you talk about, like people, it might be easy to say, well, that's Alabama, and that was over 30 years ago, but you know what? In Massachusetts, we recently just dismissed 20,000 tainted drug convictions. The ACLU and the Committee for Public Counsel Service were involved in that case, challenging that. And then another 6,000 for 2 drug laboratory chemists who tainted the evidence. But you know, when you say, well, that's not death row, that's not a death penalty case. But the integrity of the system is what's at stake. And you know, and so for all of those people, those 26 some odd thousand people who were incarcerated or who have some collateral consequences, what's their recompense for that? What did you get for being incarcerated for 30 years, Mr.
I haven't got even an apology. The Supreme Court have given the prosecutor for every state immunity. He can put false witness up on the witness stand. He can falsify evidence, and we can turn around and as good as lawyers, he can show that the prosecution lied. He can show that they falsified this evidence, and there's nothing I can do about it. I can't sue him because he have, as I like to call it, diplomatic immunity. But if any one of you out there got on the witness stand and lied and the prosecution found out and knew you was lying, you can be charged for perjury. I think we should hold them to the same standard that the average citizen is being held to. Now, I want to say something while my mind on it. We have 2 sets of justice in this country. For those who have the money that can buy justice, and for those over 2 million of us that don't have the money. It wasn't until I got a lawyer that cared about justice, that was running a nonprofit organization that through generous donation was able to hire qualified experts. That makes a difference. The prosecution, first thing he asked me, who is going to represent you in these capital cases? I said, I don't know. And he knew from that answer that he had a victory. He knew it. When you tell a prosecutor a certain lawyer name, if that lawyer is any good, they think twice a little bit. We need a justice system that you don't need money. If you're innocent, we all should want innocent people not behind bars.
And can I just interject? It's profound because I know what you're thinking, where that was just a racist officer and those are racist prosecutors. But it really is the system. The system is racist because there's no way you can get these numbers. Either you got to conclude one or two things. Black people, especially black men, are just some terrible, nefarious, criminal-minded people, number one. Or number two, you got to conclude that the system broken. I don't believe all black men are nasty, evil, criminal people. And you have to first admit that to yourself. The system is racist because, Reverend Hall, think about this. When we had the crack epidemic,
Right.
I mean, mass incarceration, the police officers, Ms. Porter could probably give the statistics far better than I. They were just warehousing black people by the dozens every day who had drug dependency issues. Now it's become an opioid crisis,
Right.
and it's white people. And they now have said it's a medical issue.
Right. It's a public
And
health
nobody
issue.
goes to jail. And in fact, on the job employment records, you can't even put that down, or you are cited for committing a criminal violation for exposing a medical issue. Now, why couldn't black people get the same consideration in America?
All right. So let me pivot to Chief, but before you do, we talk about the disparities in the system that we have, and so for Massachusetts folks, we look at black and Latinos make up 22% of Massachusetts population, but when we look at the number of people who are incarcerated, that number goes up to 54%. But then when you look at people serving mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses, that number jumps up to 75%. So to your point, right, it's either you have to believe in the inherent criminality of black and Latino people in light of the fact that the blacks and Latinos use and sell drugs at relatively the same rates as white, or you have to believe that there's something wrong with the system and that it is racist. Chief, jump in there.
So one of the things that I want to make sure you hear me say clearly is that law enforcement leaders, we're 200 police chiefs and prosecutors who were on the front line of fighting crime, if you will, from the 90s until the 2000s to we are today. And we advocate for reducing incarceration because that doesn't make us any safer. The right people in jail who are dangerous and we should be afraid of are not the same people that are in jail that we're mad at. And the second thing is another group I'm very proud to be part of, and your former West, I didn't say it, how do you pronounce the city next to us? Wellesley?
Wellesley.
That's it.
It's right there. It's right there with Worcester and Peabody.
Worcester, yeah, my brother was in Worcester, so I can get that one right. But so Terry Cunningham, who was the police chief of your town, who is the president of the IACP, he and I sat on the board together. The IACP, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, 30,000 worldwide members, 150 countries. Do you know that we have been on record since before 2010, and I did the video, advocating from the police chief's point of view that a no-cash bail bond, but a flight danger bail bond is the solution. What happens with the, thank you. Because what happens, and our friends who have been prosecutors and defense attorneys know this too, many times it's those repeat minor violations that result in a backwards, upside dynamic financially for that young man or woman, and they are being held to these archaic, Game of Thrones kind of foolish bail bonds. And I'm not against bail bonds making them money. That's not my issue. New Jersey just started a no-cash system. 36% fewer people in jail. Now, how much you want to bet that the bulk of those 36% fewer people are not the folks who had wherewithal, but the folks who didn't have wherewithal? So police chiefs are the most trusted voice. When you poll Americans and ask about these questions, it's not the sheriff, it's not the judge, it's not the mayor, it's not the congressperson, it's the police chief. So we've been training police chiefs since at least 2010. Go to your community and say, folks, people have a right to be free pending a charge unless they're a danger to the community or they're a flight risk. And that has nothing to do with whether or not they can come up with $100 on a $1,000 bail because their driver's license is expired. So your police chiefs have been asking for that for 8 years.
Ms. Porter, you want to jump in?
Yeah, and so I want to take us back a little bit. You know, I think what is important to realize, and you sort of alluded to this with your first question to me, is that the criminal justice system is complex, and there are a lot of ways to go in and out of it. And if you want to address mass incarceration challenge mass incarceration, there are a lot of different ways to do that, and they all have to be done in order for us to significantly reduce the system and get to what many people are hoping for when they do this work. I will say that, you know, we started with discussion about the drug war, and that the reality is that over half of the people who are incarcerated are in for violent offenses, and these are people who are guilty. So while the discussions of innocence are important this evening and help shine light on the unfairness and the injustices of the overall system, clearly innocence is not the dominant issue in terms of what has led to so many people being locked up and more than 19 million people in this country with a felony conviction and many more, tens of millions of more with a prior criminal history. Most people who come in contact with this system are guilty of something, and the expansion of criminal laws is what makes the system so pervasive and what brings so many people in contact with the system to begin with.
Go ahead.
And then I'll just wrap up. And why I wanted to bring that up is because it's the expansion of criminal laws and the underlying issue of race that has continued to police and center Black bodies and criminalize the notion of Blackness in this country. And I was drawn specifically to the story out of Florida earlier this week. I believe it's a quality of life offense in either Jacksonville or Tampa. Maybe you can correct me, Jacksonville, where policing arrests and citations for crossing in a crosswalk have skyrocketed in recent years. There's wonderful reporting out of ProPublica. Not only did they do a long-form article on it, which I encourage people to the audience to go to and look at, but also a video where they actually capture on camera the selective enforcement of Black residents of Jacksonville being cited by local police officers who cite the law as the context for why those individuals, the Black men, needed to be arrested. And these camera men, these reporters, also got on camera white police officers in their uniforms crossing illegally in crosswalks and not being cited. So yes, police don't make the laws. And this isn't just about police, even though that's what's sort of dominated the conversation today, but this is a reflection of the law and the fact that the system was created with Black people in mind, and the selective enforcement of laws and the expansion of criminal laws is what continues to drive mass incarceration and what results in the overrepresentation of Black residents in the system, not just in Florida, not just in Massachusetts, but in my home state of Texas and Alabama and in so many states around the country.
So, Attorney Crump, I want to come to you, and then I want to get to Mr. Hinton, because I think that, you know, the selective enforcement is key. ACLU did a report that showed in Boston specifically, even though Black people make up 23% of the population of Boston, they made up 63% of the police encounters. And even when they controlled for crime, there was still a racial disparity. So that is true. There was also a recent study, the Stanford Policing Project, that looked at motor vehicle stops and showed racial disparities for traffic violations throughout Massachusetts, despite the kind of low numbers of Blacks and Latinos in Massachusetts. So that's good. I want to come back to you, Mr. Hinton, about violent crime and the need for punishment, but Attorney Crump, you had something to say, and then we're going to come back.
Yes, sir. I just wanted to piggyback off of what Ms. Porter was saying, because the one thing that was demonstrated in Ferguson, and you've now seen it in Jacksonville, you're seeing it all over America, this systematic legalization of discrimination by going to, and it's not the police in and of itself, because I think it really is the whole system, and we're all part of this societal problem, because I do think when we start talking about solutions, Dr. King said it best in the letter from the Birmingham jail. If we're going to call ourselves moral-minded people, and when we see evil or we are made aware of evil, then we as moral-minded people, if we're going to call ourselves moral, have an obligation to do something. We can't just sit there and say, well, it doesn't affect me. Neutrality in the face of injustice in and of itself is injustice. So just like she was saying in Jacksonville and Ferguson, I'm almost certain it's happening here in Boston as well. And I hope from this conversation we can find out in this community, what are they doing with these systematic legalizations of discrimination where the statistics are screwed, where the minorities, that's the least amount of people on a percentage basis, make up the greatest amount incarcerated. Because when you keep saying that number over and over again, you at some point have to say, there's something wrong here. Black men make up 7% of the population in America, but almost 40% of the people incarcerated. And then it gets worse if you go on death row. Yes, it goes almost to 60%, but yet it's only 7%. And then it gets far worse if you go to the wrongfully incarcerated. 7% makes up almost 70 or 80% of the people who have been wrongfully convicted and exonerated. So when you keep seeing these statistics, at some point, all I'm saying is we got to say there's something not right about that. And if I'm going to say I'm a good person, I got to do something in it. It doesn't matter how many times they tell us it's legal. Because as Dr. King said in the letter from the Birmingham jail, everything Hitler did to the Jews in Germany was legal. So don't tell me it's legal, that makes it right.
So, Mr. Hinton, Ms. Porter brought up this point around the numbers of people who are incarcerated for violent offenses. Roughly 95% of people who are incarcerated are ultimately going to come home at some point. What are the conditions that people, whether they are convicted for a drug offense, whether they are convicted for a violent offense, are living in? What are some of the things that you experienced? You mentioned that you had spent some time in solitary confinement. You hear stories about these institutions being gladiator training schools. With the thought that these folks are ultimately coming home, what is the appropriate type of punishment for people who did commit violent crimes? And what are the conditions that they're living in while they're there?
Let me first say, if I said I was living in solitary confinement, I lived in solitary confinement for 30 years. Only to come out 15 minutes whenever the guards was in a good mood to let me come out for 15 minutes. I lived in a rat-infected cell. I lived in a roach-infected cell. And when you realize that, when you treat a man like a wild animal, expect him to come out like a wild animal. In Alabama, we spend $2 million to execute a man. And yet, when a man come out of prison, they give him nothing. No clothes, give him a bus ticket. I think $10, they took the $10 back. It is designed for that man or that woman to go back. That's why I think it was George W. Bush who made the revolving door with Willie Horton. When I tell you, when you take a man's pride, when you take his self-respect from him, he have nothing else left. And this is the type of condition they treat you like a worse than an animal. You know, I went to the death row. My name was Anthony Ray Hinton. they took that from me. Instead of calling me Anthony Ray Hinton, they called me Z468. Z meaning no end. I had to answer to 468 if I wanted my mail, if I wanted to go visit my mother. They would say, Z468, you have a visit. And if you didn't say, here, boss, or here, you didn't go. They stripped you of every dignity you have. I would go to the shower just like I first come in the world. Only I had leg irons around my feet. I had handcuffs, and I had to get in the shower. They took the handcuff off me, but they kept the leg iron as though I had somewhere to run. You know, I have to ask this while my mind on. The state of Alabama was seeking justice, was seeking the highest justice that they could seek, which was my life. And I have to ask you, now that I've been proven innocent, where do I get my justice? Who do I get my justice from? I live every day as though I'm still on death row. The state of Alabama, no one have said, do you need to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist? The day that they opened their door, they left me to defend for myself. And how do any of us think after living in a cage for 30 years, how do you expect a man or a woman to act? But somehow, I want to be better than those that treated me the way they treat me.
And the double tragedy here is that whoever did commit that murder wasn't held accountable. And when I tell you that police officers that I've worked with closely since 1990, we have investigated thousands of murders. New Orleans has been a murder capital, if you will, since 70 years ago. And in the mid-90s, we cut it in half and claimed success. And in Nashville, we dropped crime. We saw it drop to 40-year lows, and we claimed success. I went back to New Orleans, and with a lot of hard work, murder dropped to a 30-year low a second time. I can't tell you any more now today than I could 30 years ago about how murders happen and why they come up and down. 80% of all the murders that we know everything about, I knew the guy, whole person, I was mad at him, I found him, and I killed him. And that still strangles this nation because we have the most abhorrent murder rate of any civilized nation in the history of the world. And that is got to still be dealt with. And when Ms. Porter talked about violent people and violent crime, I've been in some meetings where people have said to me, well, there's no such thing as violent people. I said, well, all I know is this. I was there when a young man got mad at another young man and shot a baby 2 years old through the head to get to him. I don't know what you call that. And you've prosecuted those kinds of cases. What we can't do, though, and this would be my only counsel going back on 30 plus years of policing, when those things happen, we forget about all the other stuff. And everybody's focus is, oh, you got to go solve that murder. Oh, you got to go solve that murder. You got to go solve that murder. And we forget about people being incarcerated because they can't pay a speeding ticket. We forget about mental health care. We forget about the fact that reentry is true. 9 out of 10 inmates are going to get out and come back into our world. and we forget about adolescent brain development, how many of you know this? How old do you have to be to rent a car?
25.
25. You know why? Because they're smart enough to know kids ain't making good decisions yet. And I tell this to my students all the time, and I think it drives, I hope, a point to support Mr. Hinton and Ms. Porter. I tell my students this all the time. If you are in this classroom at 19 years old, what are you learning? Tolerance, thoughtfulness, listening to someone else's opinion before you draw your own. That exact same brain matter in a 17 or 18-year-old in prison, what are they learning? Fear, intimidation, dominance, violence, mitigation. And when we let these young people come back out, we suddenly think we did a good job. So you'd be surprised how far police chiefs want to move the debate away from putting people in jail. But we're not where we need to be. There's just no question about it, because there's still far too many people in Chicago being murdered, far too many people in Baltimore being murdered, far too many people in New Orleans being murdered. And we got to find a way as a community to collectively say that's enough. Final point. I've been on many a murder scene where the shooting happened and there was 200 people in the room and nobody saw anything. And I've been on murder scenes where a baby died, and before you walked out the door, you knew the name, address, phone number, social security number, and the parents' information on the person who did it. Because as a people, we won't let children get hurt. But we don't do the same thing for who are really just children, 18 and 19-year-olds. Very good research done this year, and you need to think about it.
Let me just, because in the interest of time, we want to get to the audience questions. But if we could just, as closing statements, Ta-Nehisi Coates was recently interviewed on the Colbert Show and was asked by Stephen Colbert whether or not he had hope for this nation, our race relations, our politics. And he said, no. He said, but that's not my job. Don't come to me for that. Go to your pastor, go to your friends. I'm not a pastor, but I'm an ordained reverend, and these are my friends. And so I'm asking you all, what is the thing, and just briefly, because we're running short on time, what are the things, in light of all that we are up against, in light of all of the history, in light of the roots of racism that run through this, where do we find hope in this? Attorney Crump.
I think it's real simple, and I go back to Dr. King. He said that the coward asked the question, is it safe? And then expediency asked the question, is it politically correct? And then he said, vanity comes along and asks the question, is it popular? But then he said, conscience comes along and asks the question, is it right? And he concluded that there comes a time when each of us must take a position that is neither popular nor politically correct nor safe, but we must take a position because our conscience tells us it is the right thing to do. The reason that gives me hope is I believe your conscience is going to guide all of us to be moral-minded people and do something about these terrible injustices to all God's children.
What gives me unending hope from my personal experience and research that was just released this year, 6 cities in America, in neighborhoods that have horrible relationships with the police that are driven by racism and fears of biased policing. In those 6 neighborhoods, a representative sample, more than 70% of the residents don't trust the police. More than 70% of the residents believe the police are going to behave inappropriately. But what gives me great hope is those same residents, over 70% said, we are a better community when we follow the law. Over 60% of those residents said, we are a better community if we step up and help solve the problems. And over 60% of the people in the same community said, and I'm willing to call the police to come in here. To me, what a message to send to the police, that you are absolutely upside down if you think that these neighborhoods that need you the most are not ready to work. You got to get past whatever your issues are. They've gotten past theirs. They're ready to make their neighborhoods safer and believe in them. And I believe that from my personal experience.
What gives me hope are the activists that I've been working with lately. Black women from communities in South Carolina and Texas who come from highly policed communities whose family members may have been murdered and who are motivated by the love of family members who are incarcerated, many of whom are incarcerated for violent offenses. And for those women, they continue to dream and hope that their sons and brothers and husbands will come home. Because even though they may have done something horrible, they haven't excluded them and they haven't pushed them out of their lives. So it gives me hope that those residents, those activists, are motivated to try to change laws and challenge mass incarceration and are working every day to engage in civic life and bring their people home and make their community safer.
And Mr. Hinton, before you say anything, I just want to say thank you for bearing your soul and speaking your truth in such a raw way.
What gives me hope is the letters that I receive on a daily basis from young college students that I've been blessed to go around the country and talk to, that they are determined to make this world and this justice system better. What gives me hope is tonight that you took your busy schedule to come out to hear. And I took it that you didn't come out just because you're nosy. You came out because you want to make a difference and you want to see how to make a difference. That gives me hope.
To echo the Reverend's sentiment at the beginning, whenever we discuss incarceration, we want to make sure that we allow the voices of those who have been incarcerated. No conversations about us without us. So if there's anyone here who has been incarcerated and would like to join the conversation, we want to welcome you to join first.
So the going on question, though, for a lot of people in this room is, what about black on black crimes? You know, every time somebody hears something about a black young man being killed by an officer, the first thing you hear on social media, on anything, is, well, why are you protesting black on black? Why aren't you protesting black on black crime? But you're quick to protest police brutality. What would your rebuttal be to that?
What did you say? What is the rebuttal?
What would your rebuttal be to that?
Well, so violent crime is highest amongst black men, and black men are also the most likely victim of violent crime. Homicide rates are incredibly high within the black community, and particularly among black men, and the chief already alluded to that tonight. And so to address mass incarceration and to prevent crime, there has to be a focus on targeting violent crime, particularly in high incarceration communities and urban communities. Right now, the tendency is to direct all resources towards the police when there's a spike in homicide, to increase police presence, for a range of policy reasons. And there are a range of reasons for prison that we're not going to get into the weeds on tonight, but I'm happy to have longer conversations with anybody in the room about it. And temporary incapacitation for a homicide offender is one reason, for prison. But prison should also be about rehabilitation and preparing people for eventual release. So in order to get to the black on black crime, whereas right now the focus tends to direct resources towards police, there are other prevention-based efforts that also have to be the narrative, a part of the narrative and a part of the response, the immediate response. when there's spikes in homicide and when there's spikes in violent crimes, not just in cities like Chicago, but in many of the major cities around the country. Those resources can be directed towards a network of social workers who can work in targeted communities where most of the crimes are happening. So there may be spikes in violent crime, but we know in many major cities where those crimes are, they're in a handful of zip codes in a handful of cities around the country. And so targeting resources into those zip codes can help drive crime down and can help respond to crime. Whereas now the typical immediate response is just to expand police presence as a deterrent strategy as opposed to a prevention-based approach.
Attorney Crump, did you want to respond to that?
I'll just briefly say, and I know the chief and I were talking earlier about the incident in Texas where all the bikers were killing and shooting at one another. I think it's very important that we have to acknowledge violent crimes happen in the communities where people live. There's white on white crime in white communities. There's black on black crime in black communities. And that's normally what you see happen. But there's also one other thing. You have to remember the quickest way to get to death row is to be a minority and kill a white person. It's not very often that you get to death row for killing black people. So the system is in a way telling you that black people's lives are less valuable, and they even communicating that to black people. The worst thing you can do, black man, is you go kill a white man, because you're definitely gonna die. Violence is wrong on every account, but think about the messages that we are subliminally sending to citizens in America.
Another group that I'm associated with, I'm on the National Advisory Board for a group called Cure Violence. It's Dr. Gary Slutkin's creation. He's a medical doctor, epidemiologist. And where Cure Violence has been used in the country, in the world, there's 23 different sites, and it's all about prevention. The police have no role in Cure Violence. It's the community helping itself to solve problems before a crisis blows up. And I've been on his board now for 2 years and used it when I was chief in New Orleans and supported it. But what Cure Violence does is it approaches the interpersonal violence between young people who know each other with trusted voices from the community. And unlike other murders that are stranger murders, stranger on stranger murders, which are a very small number, right? The bulk of the murders are people who knew each other, and Cure Violence is an incredible way of focusing on the crime of young men killing each other in the urban environments in New Orleans, and I'm very, very supportive of Dr. Slutkin and his work.
Yeah, I just add one thing to that is, you got to be mindful of racist dog whistle politics. When we're talking about police accountability and protesting police violence, and people say, well, what about Chicago? That's a code word, right? And so to Ms. Porter's point, what are the underlying or the root causes of the violence when you look at discipline rates of black students who are kicked out of schools, who are in underperforming schools that are under-resourced in communities with high rates of poverty, high rates of unemployment, and low educational achievement. Those are the conditions where you're going to find it's like a cauldron, where there's just this higher concentration, and violence is a crime. These are things of proximity. So thank you for raising that question.
Let me say this as well. Somebody have to teach a different mindset. I can't sit here and tell this audience, young black male, and there's been some young white male have come up to me and say, Mr. Hinton, I don't know how you can be on TV talking about forgiveness. I don't know how you do it. I'm not there. If I was you, and if that had happened to me, I would get me an AK-47 and go into the mall and get my justice that way. And I try to tell young people, that is exactly what they want you to do. You playing right into their hand. When you say black on black crime, I tell young black men, you have done far more than the Ku Klux Klan have ever done. Wow. Somebody have to speak the truth. Wow. Nobody have been a disserved than I feel that I have. And as I said earlier, I am determined to be better than what my capture did to me. I want to lead, and I want to lead by example by showing young black males you don't have to stoop to that level. Learn to talk to them.
Let me just say, it is true that violent crime is high amongst young black male age groups, but that is also a reflection of the substantial inequality that is in this country. And state violence is also violence, and the disinvestment, deindustrialization that has plagued urban areas and majority black communities for decades now is a driver for those high rates of violence. And we can get into the weeds on all of it, but I think it's also important to realize is that even in majority white nations like Russia and Eastern European nations where there are high rates of inequality, there are also high rates of violence. So the United States does have, amongst Western countries, does have a significant amount of violence. That violence is prevalent within a handful of cities, within a handful of neighborhoods within those cities. Most of those neighborhoods are majority black neighborhoods, but the conditions of violence plague neighborhoods and jurisdictions that are struggling with inequality, and that reinforced inequality that's a factor or a symptom of a range of things, including racial animus in this country, is longstanding and is one of the main drivers of violence, and it is not the pathology of young black men in the United States.
And one more last thing. I got a degree from Duke. I'm also a Navy vet. With that being said, it still made it hard for me to get a job with having an F on my record. Now I own 2 businesses and prosper opening up a 3rd. So, Mr. Hint, it can be done.
Yeah, hi. So here's my question. I work in juvenile justice. Hi, Rahsaan. How you doing?
I just went through.
So my question concerns what has been characterized as the school to prison, cradle to prison pipeline. So this incredibly provocative conversation has been really stimulating, and I want to thank you all. But what you're not talking about yet, which I think is implicit in this conversation, is more than implicit bias, and that's structural racism. So I'd be very interested in your comments about how the issues you're talking about reflect geographical segregation and the reality that 60 plus years after Brown versus Board of Education, our school systems are more segregated than they were at the time of Brown. New York City is the most segregated school system in America. So, and I think, Rahsaan, your comments earlier sort of touch on this issue. I don't think we'd have a candid conversation if we didn't talk about structural racism in America.
I tried to bring it up. I agree. I said the first thing I said was you have to talk about the racism and the discrimination that I believe is at the foundation of many of the problems within the criminal legal system. And certainly juveniles. Attorney O'Neill and I were at a conference in Los Angeles, and they had this organization called Impact Justice, and they talked about trying to reimagine criminal justice in the world. And they went all around the country, I mean, in the United States, they went all around the world looking at different criminal justice systems. And in Norway, they had 5 people in the entire country who was 18 years who were incarcerated. And in Finland, they had 4. Now think about that compared to America, because what they said is they want to believe that there's some redeeming qualities in young people, that they need to be encouraged and given incentives and taught things, because as the chief said, their minds are still developing. And it was almost taboo to them to put a young person in prison under the age of 25 and say, we just, as a society, have given up on you, that you are nothing to us. And America, we do it with 5 in a day versus, they did 5 in the entire system. So that's just my take on it. We have to speak truth to power when we get opportunity. And I'm sure there are some exceptions that everything isn't discrimination and race, but so much of it is, it's hard to overlook it when you start talking about the criminal legal system.
So I'll do the best I can to be a Ph.D. I mean, I get paid to do that. Social scientists have been trying to figure this crime thing out, and a lot of them look at the inside of the person, their individual characteristics. A lot of them look at the environment. But there's a group of social scientists that I've always found the most interesting, and those are the social scientists who look at it and say, why didn't they choose?
Right.
So Travis Hirsch and that crowd, A General Theory of Crime, and I think it kind of tangibly touches your point and everything we've been talking about. As a police chief, I was always disappointed that when young people would get in trouble, the media and the community and the neighborhood would focus on that young person. They were outnumbered 100 to 1 by other young people in the exact same circumstances who didn't choose to hurt somebody else or to hurt themselves. So I've always wished as a nation, especially working in juvenile like you do, that we would spend as much time focusing on why young children who are in the exact same conditions, overwhelmingly are the ones, they don't choose crime. They have all these other impediments to deal with. They don't choose crime. And it's always been the most fascinating thing. We ought to focus on that and then lift that up as to say, he and I grew up in the same neighborhood. We grew up with the same exact conditions, the same exact institutional racism. I didn't go kill anybody, and he did.
Right. It reminds me of the book, The Other West Moore. It talks about 2 young men from Baltimore, same name, same year of birth, but 2 very different paths. But Judge Blitzman, to your question around structural and institutional racism, like Attorney Crump said, I think we've mentioned aspects of it without necessarily naming it. And so I've done myself a disservice because I always make it a point to, whenever I speak publicly, to say the words white supremacy and put that out in the atmosphere. 1, to give people permission to say it, but then 2, also to let people know that it is a thing, and it's not Nazis and skinheads. It is an ideology that is at the very fabric of this country that centers whiteness and makes the values, lives, properties, and bodies of white people higher than that of anyone else. And so you can have a system that begins with slavery, and then when they're legislating or debating the 13th Amendment, you have Southern plantation owners saying, this 13th Amendment thing is going to work out for us because we are able to maintain our system because of the provision in the 13th Amendment that will still allow for slavery under incarceration. And again, there's that seamless thread that runs through it. And so I mentioned the ACLU report on police stop and frisk. Even though there are, when they control for crimes, there's still a disparity in arrests. That is the structural institutional racism that you talk about. When I mentioned that, or prior to being at the ACLU, I was at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and we did a report called Not Measuring Up that looked at school discipline rates in Massachusetts. It showed that 1 in 27 white students were disciplined, 1 in 10 Latino students were disciplined, and 1 in 8 black students were disciplined for non-violent, non-criminal, non-drug offenses. This is for coming to class late, having your pants not pulled up, talking back to your teacher. And there's the correlation between school discipline, school suspension, school expulsion, and ultimate involvement in the criminal justice system. And this is the cycle that perpetuates itself. And then you place on top of that the media perception of the criminality of black people and black communities. And so we don't ever ask the question about why did these other young people not commit crimes, because the narrative that exists that is rooted in white supremacy and racism is that there's a pathology that exists in these particular communities, and that is par for the course. And so I think that until we have more of these conversations and really call out and truth tell and talk about white supremacy and structural racism, that we'll continue to dance around and talk about criminal law reform that tweaks around the edges without ever really getting to the root of what's ailing us.
Oh, hi. Thank you for your engaging discussion and informative discussion. I just wanted to say that I was actually living in California at the time that that 3 strikes law was passed. I didn't vote for it, happy to say.
Good for you.
But I would like to say my opinion of it at the time was that Pete Wilson, who was running for governor, was exploiting the fear and these racism to win the governorship. And I'd appreciate if you could comment on the role that politicians play in exploiting fear to lead to these consequences.
I would be glad to. I worked for 1 governor and 3 mayors. And one of the mayors I worked for is the most gifted leader I've ever been around in my life, because he was honest enough to say, politicians aren't leaders. They're just quicker at figuring out where the crowd's going. That's what he said. And that makes a lot of sense if you think about what's going on today, if you think about what's going on in Pete Wilson's day. And who gets caught in the middle of that is all of us, right? We'll pass Jim Crow laws. We'll pass laws. Like, for example, why do we have driver's license laws? Because if you get in a wreck, you want to know who you got in a wreck with, right? This is a civil issue. It's turned into a bane of policing because it's been made criminalized because people don't have enough money to pay a fee. They turn into a criminal as opposed to what was the purpose. If we get into a civil accident, I know who you are, you got insurance, I got insurance, and we can go on our way. And it's been turned into this incredibly other perverse thing that young officers are nowhere near educated, trained, or experienced enough to understand all the moving parts. And we have error. We have tremendous error happen.
I think what's troubling about politicians' use of fear is that despite the last 15 years or so of being critical of mass incarceration, and I think this window of opportunity we were in up until 11 months ago around, challenging mass incarceration, and people were really excited about bipartisan coalitions to address mass incarceration, that with number 45 and his political rhetoric in recent weeks and recent months, that his first talking point in criticizing political opponents, this happened in the Virginia Senate race, and it's happening currently in the Alabama race that folks will be voting on next week, is the number one point in terms of why people should not vote for the opponent is they're weak on crime, they're weak on immigration, those are the 2 main talking points in the robocalls and the other sort of political speeches that he's been giving. And so I think we talked about Willie Horton earlier. You mentioned Wilson and his rhetoric around driving people to the polls in support of the 3 Strikes ballot initiative in the 90s. It's despite the hope that we ended the panelists' comments on, that is still the status quo. And that is still where politicians are willing to go. So I think one of the outcomes from this conversation, I think we focused a lot on the problem and data and statistics. And, I do want people to leave with next steps and solutions. And I think one of the things that you all can do as a community is to push back against that and not to let politicians bring us back to where we were in the 80s and in the 90s. And I hope this community continues to have dialogues like this one. There are books that you all can be reading together as a community center. There are movies that you all can be watching together as a community center and continue to have this dialogue and not let 45 and his cohort bring us back to the tough on crime era of the 70s and the 80s.
So the Rev's going to give me this point.
Just one point, I think we got to wrap.
Look, my group has been hypercritical of any return to the 1990s. We had made it akin to trying to play Joe Montana's offense of the 1990s with Tom Brady. It makes no sense to us in law enforcement. But let me be honest, I'm almost 60. Hard to believe, right? I've been around a little while. And this is what frustrates me as a voter. Whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans in the White House, the Senate, or the Congress, they have collectively, both parties, refused to fund gun research. We know more about the mating habits of squirrels. So it's not about 45, because 45 is not going to fund it. 44 didn't fund it. 43 didn't fund it. 42 didn't fund it. 41 didn't fund it. We have to not let people get off because of political designation behind their name.
And on that note,
unfortunately, we need to wrap up. It's a school night and people need to get home. But I want to thank our panel again. That was an incredible conversation.